The War Museum of the Boer Republics in Bloemfontein, South Africa, want to remind all our visitors of the suffering of all South Africans in the South African War. This war happened more than 100 years ago. Most people are not aware that more children than adults died in this war. How many children died, you may ask? More than 40,000. To show you how many 40,000 is, think of the Free State Stadium in Bloemfontein, where they often play rugby or soccer. Believe it or not, the children who died in the war would fill all the seats in this very large stadium. We think you will now agree with us that the death of so many children makes this war a terrible part of the history of our country. We at the museum do not want people to forget about the children who died in the war. There is a large statue of a mother with a very sick child on her lap that you can go and have a look at. You can also read the names of some of the children who died on the walls of what we call our Garden of Remembrance. If you feel like it, you can walk in our Children's Labyrinth, which is a circle with a footpath where you can also read what some of the children said about the war. Furthermore, we have many things in the museum itself that belong to the children in the war for you to see. Some of you may wonder, how did it happen that so many children suffered and died in the South African War? We will now share with you the story of these children and what they went through. Many years ago, two countries known as Boer republics made up a large part of what is known today as South Africa. The larger of the two was called the Transvaal and included more or less what we know today as the Gauteng, Northwest, Mpumalanga and Limpopo provinces. The smaller one was named the Orange Free State and covered what is today known as the Free State Province. These republics were controlled by Dutch-speaking people named Boers, a Dutch word meaning farmers. This is because many of these people in the Transvaal and Orange Free State lived on farms. Therefore, many white children in those days grew up on farms, where their parents mostly farmed with sheep, cattle, mealies and corn. The parents of most black children did not own land, but there were a small number of small-scale black farmers. Some of the black people worked for white farmers or in small towns. There were also black people who lived in their traditional areas. Our story of suffering begins when the war broke out in 1899 between Britain and the Transvaal and Orange Free State. This would change the lives of many white and black children forever. Boys of 16 years and older went with their white fathers to war. Later in the war, many white boys younger than 16 years also took part in the fighting. Since they grew up on farms and knew how to use guns, a lot of these young boys were able to help the older Boer men in fighting the British soldiers. But life in the veld was not easy for such boys. There was little time to sleep, and when they did, it was on the ground with little shelter. Often, water to wash and food were scarce. Unfortunately, a number of these boys were shot and killed while fighting with the Boers. But what about black boys in the war? The Boers took along many of the black farm workers who willingly helped them in their fight against the British soldiers. These men were known as agterryers or attendants. Some young black boys would also go with their fathers to assist the Boers. They took care of horses, prepared food and so on. Like their fathers, these young black boys could be seriously hurt when the British soldiers fired their guns and cannons at the Boers. It is true that some of them must have been killed while they were fighting, but we do not know how many died. Don't you also think that it is terrible that such young white and black boys got caught up in a war between adults? But that is what unfortunately happened. In the beginning of the war, the Boers won several battles against the British soldiers. But later on, the British began to defeat the Boers. However, there is an old saying, "A Boer makes a plan." The leaders of the Boers decided to change their way of fighting. They divided their men into smaller groups on horses that could attack the British without warning, and then go into hiding in the veld again. The Boers were very good at this type of fighting. They bombed railway tracks and bridges to make sure that the British Army did not get all the food, guns, bullets and everything they needed. The Boers in the veld were helped by their families, who still lived on farms throughout the Transvaal and Orange Free State. Their families gave them food, nursed them when they were sick or hurt, and could also tell them where the British soldiers were and what they were doing. Lord Frederick Roberts, the leader of the British soldiers, soon realized that the only way he could win the war was to stop the families on the farms from helping the Boers in the veld with food and information. He then ordered that Boer families must be taken off the farms and that the houses on about 30,000 farms be burnt down. To make sure that the Boers in the veld did not get any food, crops on farms were also burnt, while sheep and cattle were shot. Can you imagine how horrific this must have been for the children who lived on these farms to see this happening? Even their pets, like cats and dogs, were killed. Lord Roberts thought that the Boers would then stop fighting and give up. Then the British would win the war. But he was wrong. Burning their farms and taking away their families made some Boers so angry that they decided to keep on fighting to the end of the war. Furthermore, removing so many thousands of people from farms would cause a terrible time of suffering for white and black children in the Transvaal and Orange Free State. The Boer families were taken to places that we call concentration camps. A large number of Boer women, children and older people were placed in about 50 such camps for white people, where they had to live until the end of the war. The people in charge of these camps could not cope with so many people coming in every day. Some camps, which were supposed to keep only 500 people, now had to fit in 3,000. Most families had to live in tents in the open veld. These tents were terribly hot in the summer and freezing cold in winter for the children. In the camps, Boer children helped their mothers with cleaning, cooking, getting water, washing, gathering wood and fetching the little food that the British gave them. In many camps, children were taught in schools by English-speaking teachers. Children could also go to church services and Sunday school, often dressed in their best clothes. Many children brought some of their toys along to the camps. Playing with these toys helped them to forget for a while about their suffering. Sometimes they took part in sports and played games to keep them busy. But too little food, unclean drinking water, and the bad tents in which they had to live caused many people to get sick. There were also not enough nurses, doctors and medicine to heal them. More than 20,000 of these children died from illnesses in these camps. The houses of black farmers living on small farms of their own were also burnt down by the British soldiers. Their farm animals were likewise killed. All the families of black farm workers who worked on white farms were taken to special camps for black people. There were about 70 such camps for black families. These people also suffered greatly. The shelters that they often had to build themselves were not only hot in summer and cold in winter, but also wet when it rained. As in the case of white families, these black families also did not have enough food and clean water. Therefore, many of them got sick. Likewise, there was also a shortage of doctors, nurses, and medicine. More than 20,000 children also died in these camps for black families. Do you now realize how the children suffered in these camps? Many of their mothers, brothers, sisters, and friends died of disease, and there was nothing that they could do to help them. During the war, Boer fighters who were caught by the British soldiers were sent by ship to overseas camps in far-off places such as India. Sons who were caught while fighting alongside their fathers were also placed in these camps. There were about 1,400 boys between the ages of 6 and 15 years. In these camps, the boys had to go to schools where they were taught by older Boers who were teachers before the war broke out. To give them something to do after school, the boys learned how to do woodwork, for example. They could also do various types of sports. Whenever they could find the time, many boys liked to play marbles. Many of the black farm workers, known as agterryers, and their sons, were also sent to these overseas camps when they were caught. Here is such a young black boy in an overseas camp. Can you imagine what it must have been like for all these boys to be so far away from home? They missed their families in the Transvaal and Orange Free State a lot. And many of them were worrying whether their fathers, mothers, brothers and sisters were still alive or not. These young boys and older Boers were sent back to South Africa when the war ended in 1902. We at the museum believe that all South Africans must always remember these innocent children who suffered and died in the South African War. The big lesson that you must learn today after visiting the War Museum is this: wars will not happen if people talk to one another until a problem is solved. Because war is cruel, and it is always the children that suffer most.